I don't know that I've ever heard such a quiet group of people in all of my life. I don't know if that means you're ready to study or you just don't have anything to say to each other or what it is. But it's about time to begin class tonight, so let's go ahead and open our Bibles to Judges chapter 19. Got a handful of things to say before we get there, though, tonight. I wanted to, first of all, welcome everybody here, even those I can't necessarily see around the poles in the room. This is an amazing number of people on Wednesday night. I know that there are a few more that will be making their way in, Lord willing, in the next few moments. I know that's probably relative to a couple of things. One is, I know we have visitors with us tonight, and for all of our visitors, we're glad that you're here with us. I know there's no ladies class tonight, so that forces some of you upstairs with us. So I apologize for that in advance before we get started. But we are glad that you're here. I know that we have some that are members of Bear Valley, but not traditionally here at the building for Wednesday nights in the last little while. So we welcome you. Glad that you decided to come our way tonight. I wanted to give you just an overview very quickly of what's going to happen in the next few weeks in this class or in this particular time slot on Wednesday nights. We're finishing Judges tonight, and I'll reserve my celebration of that for just a moment and let you know that next week we will be studying the book of Ruth in a one class setting to finish up this period and time in Old Testament history. And that week is short course week for the school, and Mike Vestal will be in town, and he has graciously agreed to cover that for us in this class. And so I know that you will benefit from his study and delivery of that material from the book of Ruth next week. The following week, Denny will be teaching in this class, looking at pictures of Christ through Joshua, through Ruth, and so where we see Jesus show up on the scene and the representations of him and his work in the Old Testament, particularly in these few books. And then that next week, so that will be March the 29th, Tyler King will take over for the next 5 weeks and give an overview of the life of Samuel. And so just continuing this history section, but in a character study, looking forward to that. And so you can have all of that to look forward to. I thought about beginning tonight by asking you when you would have given up on Israel in the period of the Judges, if you were God. When you would have stopped caring or stopped trying or stopped delivering. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I would have, because then there would not be any glory to my name at that point.
Okay. And so there's a very good answer to that question. Not the one I had, by the way, but a very good answer to that question that says I wouldn't have given up, because one of the reasons why we praise and glorify God is because of his seemingly unending patience. Now, we do know that his long-suffering will run out. There will be a time when that takes place. I wanted to start tonight by saying this. I'm tired of these people. Okay? I don't know if it's because the snow delayed us in getting through every bit of it, and if we've been sort of haphazard in the way that we've covered it, having to go back and pick up chapters that we didn't finish. But after reading and studying even more in depth this week, 19 through 21, I am tired of Israel in the book of Judges. I'm tired of their unfaithfulness. I'm tired of their immorality. I'm tired of their stubbornness. And it leads to probably all new heights. If you've never studied 19 through 21, it is a despicable display of immorality. But I believe, as we've been talking about ever since we started studying through this book, it is what it looks like to live without authority, what it looks like to live without a king. That tagline that defines the book and the era of this time is a time in which there was no king in Israel. And what's the outcome of that? What's the rest of the sentence? Every man does that which is right in his own eyes. Everyone makes his own rules. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about some summary lessons at the end of our discussion tonight, but really there's nothing positive that you're going to say. What I'd like to tell you is that when you get to the end of this book, Israel has learned her lesson. there's full repentance, restitution has been made, and they are in a right relationship to God until we read something else about them, but we don't. The book ends with that very concept. This is what's described in this book: a life lived without a king, a life lived not submissive to authority, not respectful of boundaries, and this is what you get. It has been escalating all through the book, and these last 5 chapters, 17 through 21, illustrate what it really looks like. Now, if you were here 2 weeks ago, you know that we began by sort of giving an overview or a background to 17 through 21. It's not necessarily true, although it might be, but it's not necessarily true that 17 through 21 happened chronologically, that it takes place on the heels of 16 and we're just moving on throughout time and progressing in history. It might be that 17 through 21 is a sort of a flashback to some of the individual decisions that were made. A lot of times, we mentioned this 2 weeks ago, but a lot of times when you read in the book of Judges, it will just simply say that Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. That they rebelled against God again. They turned back to their old ways. However the text would describe it, without giving the details of what that looks like. And 17 through 21 give us the details of what that looks like. So it might be that the writer is simply bringing this to our attention so that we can understand what it really looked like. Because I think sometimes when we think about living a life of freedom or a life of autonomy, of doing what we want to do, we can sort of paint that in a positive light, can't we? I mean, let's just face it. Tonight, if you were told you could live however you want to live, you can make whatever decision you want to make and it's all right, how many of us would actually go out and start robbing banks, killing people? Most of us have the idea that even if we were living without restraint, that we would make right decisions. Wouldn't we think that? I mean, we're good people. We're God's people. We would do what was right. And so maybe it is that the writer's revealing to us that a life truly lived without restraint eventually ends up like this. This is how it looks. Does anybody remember any of the details of 17 and 18? At all? What it was about, who the star was, anything in those 2 chapters? Absolutely. One weird, convoluted story. I think that's a very good way of putting it. I'll tell you this story, and I'll tell you before Mike comes to town next week. I was teaching my first quarter here in short course with the incoming freshmen, and Vestal was teaching across the doorway in the upperclassmen, and we were talking about writing and that we need to write professionally and we don't need to use slang or words that would be offensive to people. And I said, that's actually true in preaching. You know, I wouldn't get up in an auditorium and call people nuts or crazy. You know, I would use more clinical terms to describe someone who might be insane, but I'd be careful just ranting about someone being crazy. Well, that week, Mike spoke in chapel every day, and the day that I said that, he spoke on Judges 17 through 21. And I think the students counted 25 different times Mike called these individuals nuts or crazy in that lesson. I just knew he was listening through the door and doing that to sort of get back at me for making that statement in class. Maybe he was, but he acted like he didn't know that I said that until a few months later, and we were together again, and he kind of poked fun at me for that. But it is one convoluted story. It does speak, or at least sound like, some type of insanity, spiritual insanity, if nothing else, for the decisions that were made. So Micah stole his mother's money. He gave it back, and she used it to make idols. He hired him a priest to come live with him. And later on, the Danites were looking for territory, so they came through and took the priest and the gods and set up this shrine in their land, and that was indicative of what people do when they go their own way. Okay, so if we thought that was bad, well, you're reading 1921 is even worse and pretty terrible. And so what we want to do tonight is just look at the story like we did a couple of weeks ago. Just look at the story. And then we're going to make some personal application, hopefully, in our own lives. I've got 7 points of application from the story if we have time to make it. It is good to have the LeBlanc family with us. Had they been here before we started, I was going to get Nariah to tell us about their work, but he evaded that opportunity or that responsibility by not being here. But anyway, hopefully you'll get it. If you don't know the LeBlanc family, hope you'll get to know them tonight. I told Michael earlier this week, I think our visits at Bear Valley, the LeBlanc family was the first family that we ever met. It wasn't staff related to the church or the school. And we were standing in line with them at a potluck at lectureship and then sat with them at a table. And that friendship has carried on all the way through the years. And they're doing great work for the Lord. And we're grateful that they're here with us this evening. All right, 19 through 21. Probably would have been good, and hopefully maybe you did this, to have read this text in its entirety before coming to class tonight. You might have been like me and been tired of these people by the time you got to the end of it. You might have closed your Bible and not wanted to read it. Sometimes we talk about Bible reading that's difficult because of the tedious names and the list of genealogies. I find this type of reading a lot more difficult because there doesn't seem to be a silver lining. There doesn't seem to be an end to the depravity and the difficulty that they face because of their immorality. What you have, and we may stop along the way and read a few things, what you have in chapter 19 as it opens is a Levite. And this Levite has taken a concubine or a wife. Now, a little bit of background, perhaps a concubine would have been considered in many respects to be a wife, but a far less important or well-treated individual in a relationship. You remember the companions of Solomon were divided into wives and concubines. Concubines served physically the same purpose as a wife, but didn't carry with it that relationship the same legal status or protection or respect that a wife would have. And so we already see this difficulty, right, as it opens up. This Levite takes for himself a concubine. But the Bible goes on to reveal to us, and in verses 1 and 2, that she becomes unfaithful to him. She becomes unfaithful to him, and if you've read the passage, where does she go? Anybody know? She goes back to her father's house. She goes home. Now, you can read into it what you want to read into it. It does reveal to us that she played the harlot against him, and so she would seem to be at fault for what happened to this relationship, that some would suggest because she went home to daddy, that maybe the Levite wasn't the husband that he was supposed to be. He didn't treat her the way that she was supposed to be treated. Let's not get lost in the weeds of that sort of thing, because it doesn't really matter. The backdrop of the story is this. You have a Levite who's taken a wife, and she abandons him and goes home to her father. And so what you'll find in verses 3 through 10 is his pursuit of her. So about 4 months has passed, and he goes out to find her and to pursue her to come with him. If you read the individual aspects of the text, you'll notice that he lodged there 3 days. He ate with the family. His father-in-law received him in gratefully and asked that he would stay a little bit longer and stay a little bit longer. And eventually came to the point where the man says, I'm not staying anymore. I've come to get my wife. I'm going to take her home, and so we're going to leave your house. And so they get up and they leave, and they journey to Gibeah. Verses 11 through 21. Where do they arrive? If you've read this, and I know many in here have, and you know the story, what's the first place that the servant of the Levite said they should stop? Spend the night. In Jerusalem. Now, for Bible students, that'd be a great place to stop, wouldn't it? What's the problem with Jerusalem at this time? It's not a Jewish city. It hasn't been conquered yet. In fact, it speaks to the inability of Israel to do what God asked them to do from the beginning of their conquest of the land, right? To drive out these inhabitants, to take over these areas. And they hadn't done that. And so the Levite says, no, we're not stopping here. We're going to move on. Why do you suppose he thought that if it's not a Jewish city? What was his fear? Probably the abuse of his wife. Probably the mistreatment by the countrymen there. They didn't have a common God or a common set of values or a common set of principles. And so we can't stay here. We've got to move on. We've got to get further down the road. They end up in Gibeah, and they end up in the city square. And a man from Ephraim comes in, and he sees them there in the square. And he begins to inquire about why they're there. And he seems to know that where they've actually landed is probably not a good place to be either. He said, I've got provisions to take care of you, but you can't stay here. You've got to seek shelter and protection and provision. And so he takes them back to his house, and he takes care of them and gives them things to eat. I want to read, though, if someone doesn't mind, they find themselves, okay, so that he's gone to get his wife. He's brought her at least as far back as Gibeah, and they're lodging there at the home of this stranger they met in the city square. Somebody read verses 22 through 25.
As they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, "Bring out the man who has come to your house, that we may know him carnally." But the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage. Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now. Humble them and do with them as you please. But to this man, do not do such a vile thing." But the men would not heed him. So the man took his concubine and brought her out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until morning. And when the day began to break, they let her go.
I told you it gets worse, right? The story and the wickedness in Israel and among the Israelites gets worse throughout the story. In fact, when you start reading this, you might have thought that our pages turned a little bit in our Bibles and we went back a little bit. What's this sound like? Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, if you use an illustration of depravity in the Old Testament, if it's not Genesis 6, it's Genesis 18, right? It's either when all men did evil in the sight of the Lord, save Noah, or it's a time when the world was so full of carnality that you had men beating on the door, wanting to have sexual relations with the angels that were visiting the house of Lot. And yet, you transfer through time and you find God's judgment, by the way, on the world in Genesis 6. You find His judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And yet you still have people who've gone back this far. This is the story. This is what it means to do evil in the sight of the Lord and to have no king and do that which is right in your own eyes. This is the explanation of it. In fact, the Bible is going to go ahead and say in verse 26 that as the day began to dawn, the woman came and fell down at the doorway of the man's house where her master was brought until full daylight. She drug herself back to the door and laid down and died. That's the story. So the man, as the chapter continues, picks her up, carries her on his way, and what does he do with her? Cuts her up, and he delivers her all around the region of Israel in protest, in anger, in frustration, in rage against what they've done to her. Now, I don't want to get into the lessons that we learn until we get to the end of the story, but I can't help but think about how much better off this man might have been had he stopped among the pagans and not among God's people. Is that a sad testimony? Now, I'm not saying that had he stopped in Jerusalem that there wouldn't have been something similar that would have happened and their lives might have been in danger. Maybe there was reality in the danger that's there, but there should be more danger in the world than there is amongst God's people. Yeah, I've had people tell me before that they're treated better by the world than they are among the Lord's people. That they're kinder, that they're more patient, that they're more forgiving, that they're more understanding than God's people. Now, I know that might be because the world typically accepts anyone and everyone in the sin that they're in, so let's not confuse that concept. If we're confronted with our sin, it's not because God's people are mean or ugly, not most of the time anyway. But there ought to be a better way to be treated, right? There is a better way to be treated, the way that God has prescribed for us to act and react and to love one another and dwell together, and yet they found rougher treatment among the people of God and where God's people live than where the pagans were living at the time. Now, the story doesn't end there. So what happens in chapter 20? We'll walk through it in a moment, but if you know what happens in chapter 20. They go to war against them. All right? They go to get these men, these worthless men who've done this to this Levite's concubine. And so what happens in verses 1 through 11 is that the Levite tells his story. The Bible says in verse 20 that all the sons of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, including the men of Gilead, came out, and the congregation assembled as one man to the Lord at Mizpah. Why did they assemble as one man? They shared what? A condominium, an outrage. These pieces have been delivered all over, right? And the story was that it was delivered because of this travesty that had happened, this tragedy that had taken place. And so they gathered together as one man to hear the story of this Levite. And that's what he does in verses 1 through 11. He tells them his story. He rallies the troops. He begins to insist that something be done for the crimes against his family. And so they decide to go to war. In fact, they suggest that they're going to take these men. You read verses 8 or 9 through 11, and they would divide these men out. They would give them certain responsibilities. Verse 11 says, "Thus all the men of Israel were gathered together against the city, united as one man." And so they came in verses 12 through 17 to the tribe of Benjamin, where Gibeah rested and where these men were holed up. And they demanded that they turn them over. It wasn't going to be war against all of Benjamin. They were just going to give these men what they deserved. They were going to enact justice for this fallen and abused woman. But what did Benjamin do? They wouldn't turn them over. They defended them. They held them away from and protected them. And so the decision was made, then we'll just go to war against all of you. Now, there's a lot of detail in this chapter that I don't know necessarily is unimportant, but you just need to read through to get all the individual aspects of what goes on. For example, they ask of the Lord, in some fashion or some way, who should go up for us first? And the Lord says, let Judah go up. So they let Judah go up, and guess what happens to Judah? They're defeated. Now, that's not the normal storyline, is it? It hasn't been the normal storyline since Joshua, except for the rare occasion when Israel's sin was being covered up and God needed to expose it by them losing a battle. So they go and they lick their wounds, they mourn to God, and they ask again, should we go up and fight? Second time, and God says, go fight. The Lord said, go fight. They lose a second battle. Still undeterred, then they go to Bethel, where the ark is. And you have a priest mentioned by name, and they go before God again, and God says, okay, go up. And this time God says, I've given them into your hand. And they defeat them. In fact, that's the rest of the chapter, those three different battles and that defeat. How many men were left at the end of it all in the tribe of Benjamin? 600. 600. You had civil war to almost the annihilation of a tribe, down to 600. Well, again, the story gets worse, right? You have a Levite, takes a concubine, she plays the harlot, he goes to get her. The men come and want to have relations with the men there in the house. Instead, they get this woman, and they end up raping her and killing her. He cuts her up into pieces, sends her out. There's civil war. There's a tribe down to 600, and that's not the end of the difficulty and severity of their immorality. Because then chapter 21 takes place. What happens in 21? What does it open with? What are they now mourning? They're mourning first that they've done this to Benjamin. We've now narrowed down this tribe to 600, and they have no wives. What are we going to do? If we don't find wives for them, then this tribe's going to be extinct. It's not going to be around anymore. So then they did two things that are almost unthinkable. In verses 1 through 7, they express this sorrow. And then in verses 8 through 15, they looked for a loophole. Now, I don't know how you're going to view this and how you're going to see it, and we probably don't have a lot of time to hash it all out, especially if it's the first time you've really considered it. But they asked the question in verse 8, was there a tribe that didn't go fight with us? Now, I think there's two things they're looking for here. If you go back to the beginning of the chapter in verse 1, it says that they made a vow that none of them would give their daughters to Benjamin in marriage. So they were bound by this oath, right? So they looked for a tribe that didn't go up, because if there was a tribe that didn't go up, guess what that tribe wasn't bound by? That tribe wasn't bound by that oath. And so let's find the tribe that didn't go. And so what's going to be the outcome? Well, we'll go wipe them out and take their wives. That's their answer. We'll go wipe them out and take their wives. And when they did that, or their virgin daughters, guess how many they found? 400. They're still 200 short, right? So guess what they do for the rest of them? You read in verses 16 through 15, you're going to read that they go to Shiloh and that they basically kidnap their women and bring them back to finish up the 200. In essence, what happens at the end of this is the same thing that happened to this concubine, although not abused necessarily to that extent and murdered. But you have this forcible marriage. Some might even suggest that they were using the Levitical law that if a woman were raped, that the man could marry her. Again, a lot of difficulty in these Old Testament texts without a lot of opportunity to give full explanation and discussion to it. But some have assumed that they were using the loophole in that law. So they took the women, they raped them, then they made them their wives because that's what God told them they could do by law. But they annihilated and captured and kidnapped to supply wives for the tribe that they themselves decided that they would cast out because of the sins that had been committed. And then it all sums up by saying, it was a time when there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. That's the story of 19 through 21. It's why I'm tired of these people. It's why I'd rather teach something else and talk about something else. But there's an interesting observation that Younger made in his consideration of this text. I want to read it to you. He says, while in previous narratives minor figures were often named, even when a knowledge of their identity wasn't crucial to the story. Okay, his point was when you read everything in Judges up to chapter 17, you read about individual names of individual people that didn't seem to have a big part in the story, and knowing their identity didn't seem to have a big part. But almost all the people in 17 through 21, almost all of them are anonymous. They're the Levite, or the man from Ephraim, or a tribe in general, but not individuals. He would say about that, the main characters are all anonymous, and their anonymity appeared to have two functions, and I'll just mention one of them. It permits the characters to stand for a wider group. The Levite can stand for any Levite. The concubine could stand for any woman. The father-in-law for any host. The old man in Bethel, any outsider. Because everyone does as he or she fits. Every host is capable of committing atrocities. Every woman is a potential victim of rape, murder, and dismemberment, and so on and so on. This is a general story because it can apply to every aspect of the book of Judges, and I would suggest to you it could have an aspect of application of our lives as well because of its autonomy, because of its generalness. That we could fall victim to some of these same principles and sins and problems and difficulties if we lived according to that which is right in our own eyes. And so lessons to be learned in the next 15 minutes or so from this story and these stories. I'll start, though, with you. I've got 7. If I don't get to all of them, that's fine. What have you picked up on? What has struck you? What has angered you, maybe, that you've learned or seen in our study of this text, either tonight, 2 weeks ago, or just the entirety of Judges? Anybody? Okay. These are totally godless people. And I think the writer wants us to think that, wants us to hear that, even though there were moments of faithfulness, right? There were people who were raised up during this time period who were faithful and right and just, yet the overall feeling we get when we read these last 5 chapters is these people were godless. They really were doing that which was right in their own eyes. Denny?
Kind of playing off of Karen's comment. Without God, there's no limit to depression.
Absolutely. One of my applications is that one decision can lead to major consequences. So one departure, right? One overstep, because I'll do what I want to do regardless of what God says, will eventually snowball into something else. You think about Samson's marriage and what it led to. You think about the the Micah in chapter 17, stealing his mother's money and all the things that fell out from it. You think about this Levite taking a concubine and then her leaving and him having to go and all the things that fell out because of that. There is no limit. In fact, if the story would have continued, I'm convinced we would have even more, right? That's what the world looks like. That's Genesis 6, that's Genesis 18, and that's going to be the end of time. It's going to progress and continually get, in some areas, in some ways, worse and worse.
Kind of in relation to that, I've heard people make comments about, I don't need God to be a good person, but I think this is evidence that without God, we're not natural good people.
Okay? That could open up a can of worms. The proverb writer would say that foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. I would say it this way, and maybe you disagree, but I'd say it this way. In a world of sinfulness, in a world of immorality and wickedness that's so readily available, if God's not our center, the only other option we have, we will eventually go that way without some reason to be anchored. It's why I mentioned a moment ago, we may think that we're good people, and we may be good people at heart, but when you take God out of the equation, eventually some generations are going to come along that says, well, why would I obey this? Why would I follow this? Why would I believe that if there's nothing to anchor it to? And so we would eventually just cave to those pressures around us. God is the anchor that keeps us from doing that. He's the centerpiece that keeps us from falling into that trap. Well, I think too, why were they even fighting Benjamin? Because of rape and murder and this aggression. And what did they do in response to their own fight against Benjamin is rape and murder and try to fix it that way, right? The self-awareness is certainly something missing in their life because they were guilty of the very same things they were mad about earlier in the text. Yes, sir.
My daughter and his concubine is coming against this group of people because they've made this atrocity, and yet here we are making an even bigger atrocity, and it's like trying to justify it. Well, this would be even worse. Raping this man would be even worse because for some reason but if you look at the Bible, you look at, the laws of Moses and everything, the story of Adam and Eve, it all is, it's one simple equation. To sin is to die.
Right.
And all sin is death.
Well, I'll just say this. The difficulty with the offer of the women is difficult in Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's difficult here, right? I mean, have you ever had anyone ask you why God would allow for that? Remember, these are men making decisions in the moment. It's not God saying, hey, how about you send the women out instead of the men? This is another example of that depravity, of that difficulty that they had in recognizing right from wrong and realizing that sin is sin. All right, let me give you a couple that I have, and then if we need to open it back up, we will. I'll skip over a couple of them. We might come back to them in a moment. I think sexual sin, I think we see this in this text. I think sexual sin is a catalyst to greater sin, other sins, but it's also a symptom of a deeper problem that exists. Whenever there's struggles in a society and God rains down judgment in major moments, sexual sin is often involved in that, right? It's often that difficulty. You read Romans chapter 1 and God giving the Gentiles up and eventually that culminating in the sexual sins that they commit. You look at some of those converted in the New Testament, what they used to be, and you have the sexual component to that issue. You have it in Sodom and Gomorrah. I believe you have it in Genesis 6, and you certainly have it here in 19 through 21. You have this sexual debauchery. Now, some would suggest that the other things lead to that. I would say that is a gateway to others. Lust and sexual fulfillment outside of marriage often leads to other sins. It brings the door open to the other things that they face. And I think we have to admit that. And not treat or not act as if dealing with that type of sin is the same as dealing with others. I'm not going to get up here and rank sin and some being worse than others, but if a sin leads to 4 other sins, that sin needs to be addressed seriously. We live in a world, in a society now where sexual perversion is normalized, it's okay, it's part of who we are, and all it really is, in biblical terms, is a rejection of God as our Lord. That's it. And it will lead to other things. You ever heard someone talk about pornography being a harmless sin, a personal sin? But yet we've watched families, we've watched relationships, we've watched homes be ripped apart because of those kind of addictions, because they lead to other issues and other problems. And God tries to remind us all the way through in the Old Testament as he chastises the people, as he judges them, as he brings judgment, as he describes what it looks like to live without God at our center, that we should avoid those things. And yet sometimes we don't see that. So it's, I believe, symptoms of deeper issues as well as a catalyst to commit even more sin, more opportunities, more need to cover sin as a result of that. David's the same way, right? Sin with Bathsheba, it led to opportunities for, in his mind, a need for more sins to be committed, because that's the nature of sexual sin. Another lesson I think that we see, particularly from 19 through 21, is that national sin will impact the home. Living in a nation or a world or a society saturated with godless intentions will eventually impact our families. It's not an excuse by any means. It's not an out that we can use because our children don't grow up to be faithful, but we need to admit that the society that we choose to be a part of, or that we're simply made a part of in our birth, will impact our home. And it means then that we need to try even harder to protect our children and our grandchildren from that depravity and difficulty in our world. We have to. And while we may not put ourselves in the feet of those or in the shoes of those in Judges 19 to 21, it is true. Think about the children of the leaders to come immediately after the Judges, the book of Judges. Who are the 2 most notable leaders early in the book of 1 Samuel? Do you remember? Eli and Samuel. And what do we know about their children? They were terrible. And they were the reason why Israel at least used that excuse to give us a king like all the nations, because your sons are not faithful. It's why Samuel was called, because Eli's sons weren't faithful, right? Well, why was that the case? I think sometimes we may unjustly cast the shadow on the child rearing ability of Eli and Samuel, and maybe that's part of it. It even says he didn't restrain them. But they lived in a society that's like this one. The period of the Judges wasn't over until Israel got their first king. This is the world they grew up in. And it impacted them. A lot of times what we do, though, when our children are unfaithful and our grandchildren go away, who might we blame? Okay, we might blame ourselves. And I've watched parents beat themselves up. And maybe some of it was self-inflicted. Maybe they could have done some things different. But who do we generally blame? We blame the church. God's people aren't to blame. God's faithful people aren't to blame. They're not. And I think we need to rest in that and believe that and support one another in the rearing of our children. And so as goes the family, so goes the nation. As goes the nation, sadly, in many cases, so goes the family. And another consideration before time is up, I have a couple more that I really want to get to if possible. Just because God allows something to take place doesn't mean that it's going to be positive for His people. I really struggled reading through this and making sense of those first 2 battles when the Lord said, go up and fight. In fact, I read what others might have considered about that and their explanation and rationalization of it. You know, a lot of individuals, a lot of commentators or writers suggested that they weren't really asking the Lord, and the Lord wasn't really giving the response. It wasn't until they went to Bethel and the Ark of the Covenant was there and they asked and they got the right answer. But the text says the Lord said. The text said God told them to. Why do you suppose God told them to go even though they were going to lose? A lesson to be learned. I think he was using this moment to chastise the 11 tribes as well as the one. I mean, a lost battle usually was that in the Old Testament, wasn't it? It was a chastisement. It was a lesson learned. If you went up and fight, remember Jericho and Ai, if you go up and fight, you take what you shouldn't take, you're going to lose. And they learned from that. Well, even though they didn't do what the men from Gibeah did, they were still immoral people. They were still living ungodly. They were still doing what was right in their own eyes. And so I believe God used those first two battles to punish them, to show them that He's still in charge. And if He wants them to lose, they can lose, and maybe it would wake them up eventually in also doing that with the tribe of Benjamin. And so we need to realize that while God allows things to happen, they're not necessarily always positive for us. I think that would stop us from sometimes asking why God allows certain things. You know, when tragedy strikes, when disaster strikes, when natural disasters occur, and sometimes people say, well, I just can't believe God would allow that. Why wouldn't God allow that? Have you seen the world? Have you seen our actions? Have you seen our demeanor and our approach to Him? We live in a world where a lot of people do what's right in their own eyes. So if God allows tragedy to happen, maybe it's for the same reason He brought it about in this generation, is to teach us something. I think the question's unfair. If we were a perfect people living in a perfect world doing right and then tragedy struck, maybe we'd have an argument. Sometimes God allows things to happen and the outcome is not positive in this life or in this moment for us. The final observation I want to make, and if you have some more, we can open it up if we have time. And this one has stood out to me since the very first time that I ever studied chapters 19 to 21. And I don't have a catchy little phrase to give, so I'll just kind of explain what I'm thinking. Israel was so steep in sin and lost their way and was living according to their own whims and wishes that they had begun to do to one another what God had commanded them to do to those 7 nations of the land. We talked about this when we first started studying the book of Joshua, making sense of all the killing that's in the book and why God would send them to utterly destroy. And that word in the Hebrew is it means that devoted thing or the under the ban, the destruction. This idea that you set this apart. When Achan took the spoils of Jericho, he took the thing which was devoted to the Lord. That's the same word. Okay? In this text, particularly when it comes to the tribe of Benjamin, they're going to set out to utterly destroy them. Now, it's interesting to me because we've read earlier they passed through Jerusalem that's not yet inhabited because they didn't choose to utterly destroy the people like God said. They failed in carrying out that command against the nations of the land, and yet when they got angry and frustrated and emotional, they decided to carry out that very same thing against their own people. By the way, the devoted to destruction, the utterly destroy command was not given to every enemy of God's people on every occasion. It was only to those particular people. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, He's going to list the nations they were to do that to, and He's going to tell them there's some other nations you can make treaties with, and you can find peace with, and you can get along with, but these you have to drive out. And yet they failed to do that. And then in their rage, and their anger, and their hatred, and their fear, they turned on one another and began to do to one another what God told them to do to the people of the land. I don't know if there's any greater description of how far away they had gotten from God than that. All right? Couple of minutes left. Any other lessons? I've got a few more, but I'll share them if I need to. Any other lessons or thoughts about these chapters or any other chapters in the book?
I think that I suspect that it's not a failure on the part of Joshua in capturing Jerusalem, but it's the plan of God that it not become the city of Joshua, but the city of David.
City of David.
So the lower city is captured, but not the upper city. And so the Jebusite fortress would be up in the upper city, and that's saved for David because it needs to be the city of David, not the city of Joshua.
And it's going to be, and it's going to define his reign. It's going to allow him to unite the kingdom under his rule. And God saves that for him and allows him to carry that out. Anything else?
You know, your comment just now strikes me that in some ways the modern church is in the same situation that they were. And that is that God has given us a message to go out and reach the lost and to change the world. And for whatever reason, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of frustration, sometimes out of anger, the church turns against itself and fights against itself rather than doing the mission that the Lord set before them. And we're not to this extent. I mean, we don't kill each other. We don't, capture each other's wives, but we seek to hurt each other and harm each other in inward fighting rather than looking outward and doing what God really wants us to do, and that's seek and save the lost.
I would add to that, I think we justify it by claiming that's our mission, right? Our mission is to hold fast to truth and to defend truth. And when we see anything in the church that has just a kernel of possibility of being wrong, we're jumping on it, we're fighting about it, we're calling people out, we're writing them up, while the world's dying, not hearing a message that we have, in abundance in our hearts, in our Bibles, in our pews, in our pulpits, and we feel justified in it. And I would dare say that as these 11 tribes went after these men, they felt justified. They felt righteous indignation because this travesty had been committed against this woman. And yet, they had left other things that God had given them to do undone, even before this tragedy ever struck.
That's the phrase in the book. They did what was right in their own eyes. I mean, what they did, they thought was right. It just wasn't led by God. It was led by their own abuses.
And maybe to bring it full home to application, rather than looking at what everyone else is doing in the church, let's just take a moment of self-reflection and see what we're doing. What are we most passionate about dispelling or dispersing or engaging in, or arguing about, or sharing with somebody else? And if we could all be the people God wants us to be, just the people in this room, that would change the world dramatically, just if this group did that. And we would, I believe, be infectious to those that are around us to want to be a part of that same mission and purpose without the arguments and the fighting and the bitterness and the civil war internally in the church. All right, appreciate so much your attention. I'm glad that we are done with those people, and hopefully we won't become them. All right, we're going to take some time here and make some announcements.